In this session, we are going to be discussing how to handle lost or stolen devices. As we discussed in Lesson 4, there are a couple of different ways that we can handle this scenario: Endpoint Protection Services, or EPS, and blacklisting. Let's take another look at the table from Lesson 4. In this table, I've outlined what is actually happening in each of these scenarios at the network and application layer. If you look at EPS, you see that this scenario is only enforceable by an administrator. However, blacklist is something that can be done by the user or by the administrator. The EPS approach is a very aggressive approach, completely restricting the device to a very small level of Layer 2 access between the device and the NAS. It also provides no feedback to the user. This approach would probably be used for the worst offenders on the network, a device so untrusted that the network administrator doesn't want to allow any access. The blacklist approach is a little more friendly, giving the user some feedback at the application layer. We'll now do a deep dive into both scenarios, looking at the configuration and how to affect the denial of access. EPS, or Endpoint Protection Service, is a very unique scenario within ICE. It sits outside of the normal flow in several ways. We'll discuss that more as we move along. As I mentioned before, to enable Endpoint Protection Services, you first must go to Administration, Settings. On the left-hand side, we'll select Endpoint Protection Service. We had already enabled that in a previous lesson. The next thing that we must do is to configure or confirm the EPS rule within our authorization policy. In Lesson 7, we configured all of the authorization rules, including the rules for lost or stolen devices. Let's just take a quick look at the EPS authorization profile and the EPS authorization rule. As I mentioned, the EPS authorization flow falls outside of the normal flow for a number of reasons. One of the first reasons is the authorization profile. Let's take a look at that now. EPS is the only configured authorization profile within the Cisco BYOD Smart Solution CVD, excluding the default deny access profile that has a radius access type that equals access reject. All of the other configured rules within the CVD use access except. Another way that EPS is different is it is actually considered an exception within the authorization policy flow. To review the authorization configuration, we created an authorization condition equal to EPS status equals quarantine, giving it the name EPS_quarantine. We then created an authorization profile called EPS quarantine, whereby the access type equals access reject. Finally, under the authorization policy, under the exception section of the authorization policy, EPS exception equals if EPS quarantine, then EPS quarantine. Now that EPS is configured, how do we use it? This is another example of how EPS is outside of the normal BYOD flow. To quarantine an endpoint, you must select Operations, Endpoint Protection Service. On this screen, you'll put in the device's MAC address, selecting the operation quarantine, and then clicking submit. When a device is quarantined, the device will not get access to any part of the network, except for extremely limited Layer 2 access between the device and the NAS. From a wireless standpoint, the user will not be able to associate to the AP, and therefore never able to even get an IP address. From a wired switch port, the ePOL process will begin, but the user will always be rejected. Again, not being able to get an IP address. To unquarantine a device, you simply reverse the process. Select Operations, Endpoint Protection Service. Again, we're going to put in the MAC address of the endpoint, but this time selecting the operation of unquarantine and clicking submit.